Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of the Hi-Fi Preschool and Kids Weekly Training Podcast. Jeremy here in the studio today. I'm so glad to be with you in this month of April as we are talking about I Am Set Apart, Live It Out. Now, if you are a preschool leader, I want to tell you, you're welcome to hang around. We love having you here. But in this particular episode, we are specifically going to be talking about kids content. The reason is we had a separate Bible story for preschoolers, and so there's a separate episode for this week about specifically talking to preschoolers and preschool ministry leaders. So if you're a preschool leader, I encourage you to go check that one out. You're welcome to hang around, but so that you don't get too far into it, I want to give you a heads up. So kids ministry leaders, thanks for hanging around with us and sticking with us in this month. As we're talking about I Am Set Apart, Live It Out is our theme. And the theme verse this month is so good. It's from John chapter 6. It says, Jesus talking says, "For I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me." And so this idea of being set apart and living out our faith and living out this spiritual life that we have, Jesus is in this verse modeling for us, saying that even he came to do the will of the Father. And so that helps us to know that if Jesus, the Son of God, God himself, needs to kind of set his mind and heart on following the will of the Father, how much more do we as his followers need to do that as well? And so here we are in session 2, and our main idea is God helps me with my thoughts. And so part of what we're doing here is every action starts with a thought in some form or fashion. And so we want to start with this. And I'd like to just take a minute to say every Hi-Fi session, this is a hallmark of Hi-Fi, every Hi-Fi session stands alone. It is not sequential, and they don't require you have previous knowledge. But when we start building out our scope and sequence, we do often think of how, if a child is there for all 4 weeks, where do we need to start? And I know this is session 2 because we had Easter the week before, but where we need to start, we need to start with transforming our thoughts. And that's where we really need to start. And we get to this passage in Peter that we're going to be talking about, living for Jesus. He starts there as well. And so we'll get to that in just a second. Crystal's in the studio with me today. Crystal, welcome to the podcast.
I am so glad to be here, Jeremy. Rachel was going to be here, but she was having some technology issues, and we got a really funny recording of her sounding like she was falling in slow motion. And so it's just going to be Jeremy and I today. But we had a good laugh right before this.
We did. Hopefully I'll be able to keep on task. But yeah, we miss Rachel in this episode. But all right, Crystal, as you know, we like to start out with a question. We do this for our listeners get to know us a little bit, but also as just a way to model, here's a question you can use in your huddle or a time with your volunteers that might help you to just do an icebreaker question for them. So we're thinking about this idea of God cares about my thoughts, and we want to start kind of in this place. So here's our question today. Do you always say what you are thinking, and what helps you filter between your thoughts and your words? And I would say it this way: are you a speak first, think later kind of person, or are you a think first, speak later kind of person? Which way do you fall?
I think most people would probably assume I may speak first, think later. I don't think that's the case. I would say I'm a fast thinker is what it is. And so I am very willing to just speak up. I feel like over the years, God has really helped me to have some good filters. Like when I was in teaching, we had posters that said, before you speak, think. And it was like, is it true? Is it helpful? I think is it inspiring? Is it necessary? Yeah. One of my favorites. And is it kind? And so I do that most often, right? Like I know people listening here work in kids ministry. And we know that kids tend to always say what they're thinking, even if it is not helpful or kind. But I do pretty well with that. I will say though, that I struggle a bit when I'm tired. If I get tired, if I get exhausted, I will say things that are not helpful, inspiring, needed, or kind. So that is the time that I feel like my filter gets a little off. But I also want to say I have a couple of people in my life that I don't even feel like I have to have a filter with. I have certain friends that like will be watching something on TV or seeing something online and just be like, that's so stupid. Why would somebody do that? Like, I wouldn't normally say that to somebody, but these are safe people that I can say what I'm thinking without a filter.
Yeah. I probably fall somewhere in that similar kind of space. I am an internal processor kind of by nature. I often don't just speak, even with those I'm close to. I am probably now that internal dialogue. If you could hear that,
Hmm.
that would be a disaster. But but I also got very few things actually come out of my mouth, and that may be some insecurity. It may just be just I don't know, just not speaking, maybe of some a little bit of getting a little older in life and trying to be
Mm.
a little bit mature and hold that filter until the filter can't be held anymore. We've seen that in some of my elderly friends and family members. So maybe there's all of that wrapped up in there. And another thing is that I am really in, so kind of shifting into our passage. One of the things that has really convicted me a lot in my life, my spiritual life, is this idea of a transformed mind, living
Mm.
for Jesus, and my thoughts being transformed. And I don't want to paint the picture that I have this figured out in my late 40s, but this is, I mean, I can remember even as a teenager this being a really important topic for me as in my
Mm.
spiritual life. And so I think maybe that probably has something to do with just the Spirit's work in me over the years. Um, and I think that when we there can be a tendency, particularly in kids ministry, if we're in a challenging ministry situation with maybe some challenging kids, and we can when we deal with them, we can kind of always put a higher priority on actions, and sometimes we can even
Right.
lean that way, even from reading scripture, talking about the
Hmm.
obedience um, and know that's important. And we're talking about being set apart this month, and we're going to get to obedience by our actions a little bit later in the month, but we kind of feel like we need to start with this idea of thoughts and Peter even introduces us to this idea, and I want to get your thoughts on this. What how what's the value here for kids as we teach them that God really does care about our thoughts and our actions, and they both matter to God? How can we can
Hmm.
use that and as we're as some guardrails as we go into this session?
Yeah, I think it's important to note too, one of the reasons why we went separate directions between preschool and kids, we really do prayerfully, thoughtfully consider every Bible story that we teach every single week. We spend a lot of time in conversations about it. And what we've come to discover, of course, is that epistles like this are much easier for kids to grasp than
Hmm.
preschoolers. Preschoolers tend to understand the concrete examples that we get from narrative stories. And so that's why preschool this week is looking at King Solomon when he asked God for wisdom and how God answered that and helped him with his thoughts. That story would also be great for kids. But we also felt like what Peter had to write in First Peter would be very, very helpful
Hmm.
for kids in a way that they are developmentally able to understand a bit better than preschoolers were. So that's a little peek behind the curtain, as you like to say, Jeremy, about why
Yeah.
we have these different stories. And so for this story in particular, I think it's amazing. This is right at the beginning of Peter's first epistle that we have here, after his greetings and everything. And he could have started by saying, and this is, I have like the actual Bible story that we have written. So this isn't just CSB, this is what you
Yeah.
would be getting in your leader guide. And he could have started by saying, be obedient to the Lord Jesus, the one who called you. He could have just started right away by saying, your outside actions need to show that you follow God. And to be honest, that would be easier for us to teach kids. And it would be
Hmm.
easier for kids to grasp, right? Like a to do list of here is what you do to obey God. But instead, Peter actually starts by saying, with your minds and thoughts ready for action, be alert and put your hope completely on the grace to come because of Jesus. Peter himself knew that the obedience that we're supposed to live out as we follow God and as we show that we follow Jesus it's not just an outward thing, but it starts in our thoughts. It starts with what's going
Mm-hmm.
on in our minds and in our hearts. It's a secret part of us that only we and God knows, but he cares about it just as
Yeah.
much as he cares about what's on the outside. I would actually even say, like, he might even care about it a little bit more because he wants that outward obedience to be a reflection of our minds and our
Mm.
hearts. And
Yeah.
then later on, he even says, let your thoughts and actions be respectful and reverent. Again, you would think respect and showing reverence is something we do on the outside, but Peter is saying this needs to be our mindset. This is what a mind who loves and follows God looks like. This is the inner person of somebody who follows Jesus. And what's so cool about it, too, is he even talks about not being shaped by the desires and wants of your former life. Before you trusted Jesus. And so that is going to be so good for kids to hear this week. There's going to be so much value in that because let's be honest, kids are growing up in a world that says what you think is true and right. What you think is what you should follow. And we get to sit there and say, what we think is not always true and right. We have thoughts, we have desires before we follow Jesus. And we're not supposed to keep going that way. We're not supposed to keep wanting the same selfish things that we wanted. We're not supposed to think in those ways, but instead, we're supposed to set our minds on the things of God and allow Him to transfer our thoughts. And so kids will get to see this week that there is value in saying, okay, I think and feel one way, but what God says is right and good is something else. I need to ask him to help me like have those thoughts instead of just doing my own
Yeah.
thing and wanting my own thing. And so I think this is going to be really good and hopefully will lead to some good conversation as kids wrestle with, but like, this is what I think and this is what I want. But what we think and want is not always right and God honoring.
Yeah, and this is as you already alluded to. This is so important in this with this generation that we're serving with this mantra of expressive individualism out there, which
Mm-hmm.
you all may have heard us talk about from time to time. Of you get to define your own self, you get to say what you think is right and live your truth, and all of those things.
Yep.
But one of the things that we say frequently every week is we say when sin is when we do what we think is best rather than what God says is best. And this
Mm-hmm.
gives us an opportunity to really put that in the context of even our thoughts.
Yeah.
Because God has told us through other passages, and you already mentioned several that Peter mentions, but in Colossians 3, Paul says, set your minds on things above. And so like there's so much about in the scriptures that talk about the the heart speaks out of the overflow of the mouth speaks out of the overflow of the heart, the set your mind on things above. All of that language is trying to help us, I think, in part realize that in our spiritual journey, that God wants to transform our hearts and He wants to
Mm-hmm.
transform our minds, and we know He wants to do that work. Part of how the Spirit of God does that work is by us taking responsibility for our own self, for taking the responsibility of setting our minds on things above. Are we setting our minds on the things above or the things of this world, which are shouting out us to define our truth and all this stuff? Or do we
Yeah.
set our minds on the things of God that say, you know what? You're set apart. God made you on purpose. God knows you and loves you and has a purpose for you. You're uniquely designed.
Mm.
How we set our minds is going to be what helps define who we are. And so this session really helps us to to I guess in a real way take it to another level. It takes us out of just behavior, but it helps us to start thinking about this idea of transforming our thoughts, and we submit to God and we submit to Him and His holiness and the Spirit of God's work in our life. We also live out the Spirit of God working in our lives
Mm-hmm.
by choosing what we set our minds and thoughts on.
Yeah.
And so having that balance is super important. And to be honest, a lot of our kids are probably not thinking about that.
No.
They're not drawing a connection, right? They're just not. Like, again, and I've said it even recently at a conference, the voices, so this is not really anything new. Kids in everybody in previous generation, I mean, you go back 40, 50, 60 years, this mantra of expressive individualism has been planting its seeds.
Yeah.
But where this generation is different than previous generations on this issue, particularly, is that the voices are exponentially louder than they ever have been.
Mm.
And sometimes I'll track it back through the years, and in some of my conferences when I teach and talk about when you go to old TV shows that says, theme song says, everybody wants to go to a place they know your name, or I'll be there for you, or
Yeah.
those kinds of things. Live your truth, and no right, no wrong, no rules for me. That when we think about this message, in previous generations, if you had something on TV or on the radio or something, like you either had to wait for it to play on the radio or you wait a
Mm-hmm.
week until it showed up on TV. Well, that's one volume. You kind of
Yeah.
air quotes volume there. That's one volume. The volume now in 2026 is exponentially louder than that because it's
Yes.
everywhere in every facet of our life, in our hands, in our ears, in our AirPods, all the time. We have this message shouting at us, and so our kids are not always thinking about the messages that they're hearing. And so
Mm.
and how they influence our thoughts. And so this session gives us that opportunity to take it into that internal level. Yes, our actions matter. And I said earlier, we're going to get to that in another session. Actions, and we get to it here a little bit. Our actions matter, but it doesn't stop there,
Yeah.
because God, in fact, it doesn't even start there. God starts with, let me transform you. Don't be conformed by the patterns of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Right.
Yes.
That's where we want to be with our thoughts. And so we want to find that balance of, we
Mm-hmm.
know that God's got to work in us to achieve that. We also know that he's asked us to purposefully set our mind on things. And so I
Yeah.
think that's a helpful place for us to start with start with our kids this week.
Yeah. Totally.
Anything to add to that? I kind of rambled there for a minute.
No, no. I mean, I just think that that's great, and really recognizing that kids are a work in progress,
Hmm.
and so we are teaching this week. We should not expect every single kid to be like, "Oh, I get it totally now. I'm going to let God start like
Yeah.
transforming my thoughts," but to recognize that we're beginning a conversation of this is what it looks like to be a Christian. This is what it looks like to follow Jesus. It's not just checking yes on a box, and then it's not just changing behaviors on the outside, but it's really allowing him to be the loudest voice in your head and in your heart, and
Yeah.
trusting that he is the one that is right and he cares about what's going on in your head and your heart. So yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
great. It's a great
That's good.
foundation to start with these kids.
Yeah. Crystal, as we wrap this up, let's think, are there some practical things that we can, some additional tips we can give? Because some of our ministry leaders out there, and I get this, I have a group of first graders at church who, they could just be a handful. Like they can, I
Yeah.
mean, uh, and this may be a little bit of a dated reference as it's not as popular of a character anymore, but it's like a whole classroom full of Tasmanian devils just spinning around and destroying everything. And they're great kids, are super sweet, but they're just all over the place. And
Yeah.
so we have ministry leaders out there who may be listening and going, I as a ministry leader, or my other leaders in our ministry are influencers, the other people, the adults and students in our ministry, they may be feeling worn out. They're feeling
Yeah.
frustrated with kids in their ministry that they just can't seem to keep on track because the behavior is out of line, or maybe
Hmm.
sometimes the speech is out of line. Any tips that we can give and leave with our listeners here on how we can help them, and how this particular Bible story can help steer them a little bit?
Yeah. First off, I want to encourage any leader feeling that way that you are not alone.
Yeah.
Guarantee if you were to talk to anybody else you're serving with, anybody who has ever served in kids ministry, anytime, anywhere, any place, has felt this before.
Yep.
We sit here and we say, yes, we want life, like heart transformation over behavior modification. But man, behavior modification would be really nice right now because it would help so much.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think first off, just recognizing, man, this is really hard for me. Talk to God about it, and talk to your kids ministry leader, director. If you are the kids ministry leader, maybe you need to have a conversation with your pastor and just say, I'm feeling really worn out and frustrated from the behavior. would you just be praying for me? If you have any ideas, any
Yeah.
tips, if I could get a week off, if we could get a extra helper in the class, those kinds of things. But really, especially as we're talking about thoughts this week, it's always good for us as leaders to go back to the truth that we are in the business of heart transformation, not behavior modification. And so when we find ourselves getting frustrated by crazy behavior from first graders or defiant behavior from fifth graders, to stop and say, I care
Mm-hmm.
more about what's going on in their heads and their hearts. And the behavior we see on the outside is not always a reflection of what's going on in the inside.
Yeah.
And so, whether it is or isn't, the prayer is the same. God, would you please be working in this child's heart? Would you please, Holy Spirit, fill them and just transform them into the incredible person you created them to be? Help them to know you, help them to love you. Those crazy first graders that you have, Jeremy, there's chances some of them might still kind of be crazy in fifth grade, in sixth grade.
Yep.
However, they might have hearts that are madly in love with Jesus, which
Right.
really, that's what we want. And so talk with somebody, feel free to just share those frustrations with the Lord and with somebody that you trust. But also remember that, like, we are in the business of heart transformation. And so when you find yourself getting frustrated, pause and pray and say, God, work in their heart and thoughts and work in my own heart and thoughts as well.
That's good. Yeah. I'm not just trying to think. I don't know that I can add anything to that. It's
Mm.
just, it is so helpful for us um, to be open and have those relationships where we can be open
Mm-hmm.
and share with what's going on, as well as just remember and ask God to, through prayer, ask him to continue to press on your heart, your calling in ministry.
Yeah.
We come back week after week, not necessarily, hopefully not because we just want to,
Mm-hmm.
like hopefully we want to, but not just because we're called to that. Like God has placed us in this ministry assignment for this reason and for this season. And so um yes, continue to invest in and look for ways to connect to the hearts of the kids that we serve, because when we connect to the hearts of the kids we serve, we're going to help them pursue transformed thoughts and minds. So thanks, Crystal. Thanks for a good conversation today. Leaders, thanks for checking us out in this episode, and we hope this has been helpful to you as you are preparing and getting ready for this session, session 2 of God Cares About My Thoughts, as we look at First Peter in the month of I Am Set Apart. Hopefully we will see you again at a future podcast. Come back and check us out next week for session 3. Well, as always, listeners, we want to ask you to, as you're thinking about and planning for and preparing for connecting to the hearts of kids, we're striving for a real connection and true belonging. We'll catch you next time.